All right, guys, so it has not been a good past week for CNN as they repeatedly keep getting exposed as the fraudulent propaganda network that they actually are. First, they were exposed by Joe Rogan, right, earlier last week. Then Miss Barry Weiss, who's essentially been red-pilled by her experience at the New York Times and seeing what's happening in our media, basically accused CNN of being one of the reasons why the world is going mad, okay? So she called out Brian Seltzer and that network to its face in regards to their propaganda. And now you have Jon Stewart, right? The basically semi-retired left-wing comedian who went on the show with Jake Tapper to talk about the threats to democracy, right? AKA to bash Trump, right? To have a Trump bashing session, right? So Jon Stewart, it was an interesting exchange between him and Jake Tapper. And, you know, throughout the interview, it was boring until Jake Tapper just kept bringing up Trump, right? Everything is Trump's fault. Trump is the biggest thing we need to worry about until finally, Jon Stewart basically tells Jake Tapper that, hey, y'all need to stop focusing on Trump so much, right? Trump's not some evil supervillain that is the sole issue in this country that we need to focus on. And I found this moment to be absolutely fascinating because it is essentially Jon Stewart calling out CNN about their Trump derangement syndrome. Take a look.
It's also obvious, and I know you've spoken about this in the past, that Donald Trump has also identified those weak points. He is now endorsing candidates for Secretary of State in battleground states, candidates who are all in on the big lie in Arizona.
I think we make a mistake focusing this all on Donald Trump as though he's, I don't know, Magneto and some incredible supervillain that has changed the very nature and temperature of the United States. Like, he's just been an effective vessel. But again, like, he's not singing new songs. This is something he's maybe singing them a little better than, Goldwater. But I think it's a mistake to focus it all on this one individual and not to focus it more on, the idea that power is its own reward, whether it be in the financial industry or in government. Like, power doesn't seed itself. And unless we can figure out a better way to balance that power for workers and voters and different groups, we'll be vulnerable. I don't know that autocracy is purely the domain of Donald Trump. I think that we all have a bit of a tendency to be like, to grant amnesty to people that are doing things that we would prefer, even if that means that they're slightly undemocratic. There's many times where I think to myself, like, just do an executive order, for God's sakes, just get it done. So I think our focus unhealthily on this one individual comes at the price of systems and dynamics that have been in place long before this cat ever learned how to surf those waves.
All right, so that was an interesting exchange because, again, Jon Stewart is calling Jake Tapper out and CNN out in a very nice way about how they have Trump derangement syndrome. Everything at CNN is about Trump. Our democracy is under attack, blah, 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 blah. And they're doing this because their ratings are terrible, right? And all they know is attacking Trump because they spent the last 4 years when Trump was in office just attacking him and had great ratings because the guy was in office, right? It made sense. But now all of a sudden, because Trump is now out of office, they have nothing else to talk about. They don't know how to talk about anything else. They can't come out here and start really going ham on Biden. I mean, they did during the Afghanistan withdrawal. But I mean, other than that, they're not really trying to go at Biden too hard because that will make it seem like everything they were saying about Trump being the cause of all our problems, right? When he was in office, that would make it seem like, oh, maybe that's not necessarily true. Maybe that's not necessarily true. And what really kills me about a lot of these left-wing talking heads, right, on mainstream media when it comes to the whole democracy thing, oh, democracy's at stake, out of one side of their mouth they say, well, it's a big lie, right? It's a big lie. So if it's a big lie, then how is democracy at stake? Because I would have to believe that, okay, if it's a lie, right? Then the only thing else left is we're talking about January 6th. So now you have to convince me that January 6th, that was actually a real threat to, I don't know, overturn the election. I don't think in any realistic scenario, what happened that day, for as bad as it was, I don't think that it would have resulted in the election being overturned. So please try to tell me where democracy is at stake here, right? It's one thing to say that that event was bad, right? And that, hey, you know what? Maybe it was bad for them to go about, their issues with democracy in that way. But it's another to say that because of that event, democracy's at stake. And on top of that, we never heard anything about democracy being at stake when you had a bunch of left-wing protesters that stormed the Capitol over Brett Kavanaugh being confirmed, right? I didn't hear the democracy at stake. I mean, they legitimately tried to stop a Supreme Court justice from being confirmed to the court, right? The highest court in the land. That's what they were trying to do. This is a part of our democratic process. Supreme Court nominations and confirmations. I didn't hear anything about democracy being at stake when you had riots all across the country all last year from little anti-government protesters, right? Anti-government protesters saying, hey, we don't like our government. We got issues with this democracy. But see, the difference is Jake Tapper and CNN, they agreed with that. They was cool with all that. Okay? They was cool with it. But unlike them, I would not call them, the BLM and Antifa riots, I wouldn't say that's a threat to democracy the same way I wouldn't say that January 6th was necessarily a threat to democracy. I would say that those were people that went about expressing their issues with democracy in the wrong way, but realistically, they weren't really a threat to democracy. But I do think that they are issues that should be dealt with and taken more seriously, particularly when it comes to left-wing extremist violence that networks like CNN and Jake Tapper don't want to acknowledge. They don't want to acknowledge that. So, I mean, again, that's what just kind of bothers me about these left-wing talking heads like Jake Tapper on CNN always talking about democracy at stake, right? But I know why they do it. They only do it because it's the same thing they accuse Fox News of doing, right? They accuse Fox News of, well, all Fox News does is fearmonger to people on the right. Well, all CNN does is fearmonger to people on the left. So you two sides of the same coin. And this kind of gets to what Jon Stewart is talking about here when it comes to systems, right? By placing all the blame on Trump, what happens is that you can't focus on the actual system, right? What's wrong with the actual system? But see, Jake Tapper, he don't want to talk about that because he benefits from that system, right? Why would he talk about that? He benefits from it, okay? He's a part of it. So he don't want to talk about that. He just wants to talk about Trump. And see, the thing is that there are deeper conversations that could be had, right, outside of just Trump, okay? For example, people on the right talk a whole lot about term limits, right? I think one of the issues with the system is the fact that politicians can stay in office literally forever, right? They accumulate power, right? In which Jon Stewart was talking about power to seize power, okay? So they accumulate power, they stay in there forever. And the part of the reason why is because they become so ingrained in the system that it's hard to actually detach them from the system. It's hard to get them out of there. How the hell is Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi and Maxine Waters, like, how in the world do you have people who've literally been in this system for 30, 35, 40 years, right? Sounds to me like we need term limits. I think Dianne Feinstein's like 80-some years old. She's pushing her 80s. How? These people have been here forever. And with that being said, I also think we should have age limits. Yang talked about how our two-party system is tearing this country apart. How if you become disillusioned with one party, you really only have another choice, that or to not participate in democracy at all. And that has given rise to a more extreme point of view on both sides. And it also serves to preserve power of the establishment, right? It preserves the system that everybody kind of agrees is broken. So, you know, the issues here that can be talked about from CNN are much, much, much bigger than Trump. But for whatever reason, they want to make it out, well, it's just solely a Trump problem. And like Jon Stewart said about autocracy, which is just basically one man running the government. If you want to put that on Trump, sure, but Trump's not the only person that applies to. I can make the argument that Biden is doing that, right? With his mandates. I can make the argument that a lot of Democrat governors, whether that's Newsom, whether that's Hochul, Gretchen Whitmer, a lot of those governors are ruling by edict, okay? They're basically dictators. So if you want to have this conversation about autocracy, we can have a conversation, because I would say that the authoritarian left is trying to build an autocratic government, right? I can make that argument because they are. That's literally what they're trying to do. And they're trying to censor out all opposing opinions. That's literally what's happening. And in my opinion, that is a way bigger threat to democracy than anything we've seen on January 6th. The direction that the left is currently headed in is a way bigger threat to democracy than anything we saw on January 6th. And don't get it twisted. I'm not condoning anything that happened on January 6th. I felt like it was a terrible, terrible, terrible day. Probably one of the worst days in Republican Party history. I've said this before. But at the end of the day, the right, they're not the people that's really trying to censor out a whole point of view, right? They're not the people calling for the plug to be pulled on right-wing networks, right? Whether it's Newsmax, whether it's Fox News. They're not the ones doing that. Calling for CNN to have their plug pull or MSNBC to have their plug pull are all liberal points of view to be hid from the public, right? To not be a part of the mainstream conversation. But that's currently what's happening on the left. And in my opinion, that is a way bigger threat to democracy, because now you have it so there's an establishment and a power structure in place that is there, whether that's through, politics, whether that's through the media, whether it's social media, wherever, right? Culture, there's this whole establishment system in place that's designed to filter out certain opinions. And when that happens, people have a very narrow worldview and they're not exposed to different perspectives. That in of itself is a threat to democracy, okay? And CNN and Jake Tapper, they're a part of that. They're a part of it. So, like I said, I just find it interesting, when people on the left, people like Jon Stewart, go after the authoritarian tendencies of the left. People like Jake Tapper and CNN. And it really shows you why CNN never brings anybody on their shows that actually will call them out on this stuff. They always try to play it safe because they know that they can't really rebuke this stuff. So it's hilarious when they bring somebody on the show that they think is safe, that's not going to call them out on their BS, and they end up getting called out on their BS anyways. And then you just watch them squirm. But Trump. That's basically what Jake Tapper did this whole interview. But Trump. He has nothing else. He doesn't know anything else but that. And that's not working anymore for this network. Their network is failing, literally failing because of that. So, like I said, that was a fascinating conversation. Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.